May 1940, the most powerful army in Western Europe was commanded from a medieval castle on the outskirts of Paris. The Château de Vincennes had thick stone walls, vaulted ceilings, and a communication room in the basement. But there was a problem. Gamelin did not use radio to command the battle. General Maurice Gamelin, the supreme commander of French and Allied forces, relied heavily on telephones and couriers to carry his orders to the front. A dispatch rider would take a sealed envelope, set out for the next headquarters, and arrive hours later. By the time the message arrived, the situation on the ground had already changed. The reply took hours more. In a war that would be decided in days, the supreme commander was fighting at the speed of a courier on a map of France pinned to a wall in that castle. Colored markers showed where the French army was supposed to be. 5 million men under arms. Over 100 divisions, the strongest fortified border in history, and 6 full months to prepare since the war began. A portrait of Gamelin from this period shows a trim, composed officer with thinning white hair and the confident posture of a man who believed he had prepared for everything. But none of it would matter, because in about 6 weeks, from the opening assault in May 1940 to the armistice in June 1940, France would lose the campaign. French losses were severe. About 85,000 soldiers were killed. About 120,000 were wounded, and more than 1.5 million were taken prisoner. This is the story of how France fell in 1940, not because French soldiers were cowards, not because the army was small or poorly equipped, but because the system above them, the chain of command, the doctrine, the very way they thought about war, was broken before the first shot was fired. And the tragedy is, some people saw it coming. To understand why France collapsed, you have to go back 20 years. In 1918, France won the First World War, but at a staggering cost. At 1.4 million French soldiers were dead. Another 3.5 million had been wounded. Entire villages in the northeast had been erased from the map. A photograph from the aftermath shows the landscape around Verdun. The ground looks like the surface of the moon. No trees, no buildings, just craters and mud. That image burned itself into the memory of every French general who survived. So when France began planning for the next war, the answers seemed obvious. Build a wall so strong that no German army could ever cross it. The result was the Maginot Line, named after André Maginot, the French Minister of War who pushed for its construction. The line stretched roughly along France's border with Germany. It took over a decade to build. The cost was enormous, beginning at about 3 billion francs and nearly doubling by 1940. The fortifications were extraordinary, 45 major forts and nearly 100 smaller ones, linked by over 60 miles of underground tunnels. The forts had retractable gun turrets that could rise from the ground, fire, and withdraw behind thick steel domes. Each major fort had its own power generators, air filtration systems, kitchens, barracks, ammunition stores, and even underground rail lines to move troops and supplies from one section to another. A cross-section diagram of one of these forts looks more like a small city buried beneath the earth than a military position. The soldiers who garrisoned the line lived in a world of concrete corridors and electric light. Photographs from inside the forts show mess halls, hospital wards, and ventilation shafts that could filter out poison gas. The line was sometimes called more comfortable than a modern city. When Winston Churchill toured the fortifications in August 1939, he was deeply impressed. And here is the key: the Maginot Line worked. It was never broken. During the entire battle in 1940, the Germans barely dented it. Some forts kept fighting even after the armistice was signed. The concrete held. But the line stopped at the Belgian border. This was not an accident. France and Belgium had been allies in the 20s and 30s. Building fortifications along the Belgian frontier would have been an insult, a signal that France expected Belgium to fall. It would also have meant abandoning Belgium to the Germans. The plan instead was to send French and British forces north into Belgium the moment war broke out, meeting the Germans head-on. But in 1936, Belgium declared itself neutral. Suddenly, The entire left flank of French defense had no wall, no coordinated plan, and no guarantee of cooperation. France could not even send officers to inspect Belgian defenses or coordinate plans without violating that neutrality. French Defense Minister Édouard Daladier sought additional funding to extend the Maginot Line along the Belgian border. Some construction was done, but the new fortifications were far weaker than the original line. They were rushed, incomplete, and nowhere near the standard of the heavy forts to the east. On a map of Western Europe, the gap is obvious. The Maginot Line ends, and between its northern tip and the English Channel lies open country, including a dense, hilly forest called the Ardennes. French exercises before the campaign warned that the Sedan sector was vulnerable. In March 1940, a French politician named Pierre Taittinger personally inspected the defenses at Sedan and warned that they were, in his words, rudimentary. The warning reached Gamelin. Nothing changed. French military planners looked at the Ardennes and concluded that tanks could not pass through it. The terrain was too rough, the roads too narrow, the forest too thick. They believed a large German force would need several days to reach the Meuse River through the Ardennes, giving France time to react. They placed only a thin screen of second-rate reserve divisions along that stretch. This assumption would prove to be one of the campaign's most costly miscalculations. While France dug in, Germany was arguing about how to attack. The original German plan for the invasion of France, known by its code name Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow, was unimaginative. It called for a broad push through Belgium, similar to what Germany had tried in 1914. The goal was limited: seize the Channel ports and push the Allies back to the Somme River. It was a plan that satisfied almost no one. Then, on January 10, 1940, fate intervened. A German aircraft carrying secret documents about the invasion plan was forced to land in Belgium during a storm. The two officers on board tried to burn the papers, but Belgian soldiers arrived too quickly. The partially charred documents were seized and forwarded to Paris and London. The Allies did not treat them as a complete guide to German intentions. But the Germans had to assume the worst. Their plan was compromised. This was the opening that Lieutenant General Erich von Manstein had been waiting for. Manstein, the Chief of Staff for Army Group A, had been pushing for months for a radically different approach. Instead of the predictable swing through northern Belgium, he argued for a concentrated armored thrust through the Ardennes forest, aimed straight at the town of Sedan on the Meuse River. A typed memorandum from Manstein, one of several he submitted to the High Command between October 1939 and January 1940, laid out the logic. The Allies expected the main blow to come through Belgium, so make Belgium the feint and hit them where they were weakest. At first, the German High Command rejected the idea. General Franz Halder, the Army Chief of Staff, called it senseless. Manstein was reassigned to an obscure infantry command, effectively sidelined. But on February 17, 1940, Manstein secured a private breakfast meeting with Adolf Hitler in Berlin. He made his case. Hitler, who had been thinking along similar lines, grasped the idea immediately. The revised plan was issued on February 24th. The main weight of the German attack would drive through the Ardennes. A supporting attack through Belgium and the Netherlands by Army Group B would serve as a loud diversion designed to pull the best Allied forces north. Meanwhile, the real hammer would fall at Sedan. One officer who understood this plan better than anyone was General Heinz Guderian, the commander of the 19th Panzer Corps, the spearhead of the entire operation. Guderian did not just study the terrain. He rehearsed the river crossing at Sedan in map exercises on February 7 and again on February 14. On March 21, his corps conducted a full war game at Koblenz, writing practice orders for crossing the Meuse at 3 specific sites. Every division knew its task. When the moment came, the order would be 5 paragraphs long and 200 words long. Its essence was simple: execute the crossing according to the rehearsal. So here is the problem. France had the bigger army. France had more tanks. France had 6 months of warning. But the Germans had a better plan, and they had practiced it until it was second nature. On the morning of May 10, 1940, the German offensive began. Paratroopers dropped into Belgium and the Netherlands. Bombers struck airfields across northern France. In Belgium, a small German glider assault force captured the fortress of Eben Emael in a bold stroke. The diversion worked. General Gamelin activated the Dial Plan, sending many of his best divisions, including the British Expeditionary Force, racing north into Belgium to meet what he believed was the main German attack. On a map of the Allied advance, the picture looks confident. Long columns of French and British troops pushing northeast, forming a defensive line along the Dial River. But that confidence was exactly what Manstein had counted on. Because while the world watched Belgium, something else was happening to the south. 3 German panzer corps, containing over 1,000 tanks and tens of thousands of vehicles, were threading their way through the narrow roads of the Ardennes forest. The columns stretched back for 100 miles. French reconnaissance aircraft spotted the traffic jams. Reports were filed, but at Vincennes, where Gamelin sat behind his stone walls, the information arrived too slowly. And even when it arrived, the French High Command dismissed it. The Ardennes was impassable to armor. Everyone knew that. By the evening of May 12, Guderian's lead divisions had reached Sedan. The French defenders pulled back behind the Meuse River, blew the bridges, and settled into their positions along the far bank. On paper, the French defensive line at Sedan looked adequate. 2 lines of trenches, concrete bunkers, anti-tank guns, barbed wire. But in reality, many of the bunkers were incomplete and vulnerable. The troops manning the line were mostly reservists from the 55th Infantry Division, older men with limited training. The French commander responsible for this sector, General Charles Hunziker, had been content to rely on concrete. He rejected the idea that the Germans would attack through the Ardennes at all. The defenses near Sedan were thin, and many of the bunkers were unfinished. On the morning of May 13, German Stuka dive bombers arrived in waves. They came not in a single massive strike, but in continuous small formations, attacking throughout the day in a rolling pattern designed to keep the defenders pinned down for hours. The Stukas did not destroy many positions directly, but the psychological effect was devastating. Their dive sirens echoed through the river valley. Some French gun crews abandoned their positions. Many went to ground in their shelters and could not be coaxed back to their weapons. In the afternoon, German infantry and engineers began crossing the Meuse in rubber assault boats. French artillery fire hit some of the boats, but by nightfall the Germans had a bridgehead. Pontoon bridges were being thrown across the river under fire. Engineers worked through the night to get tanks across. Now watch what happened next. This is where the French command system broke down completely. On May 15, 1940, the French Premier, Paul Reynaud, was told that the German breakthrough had opened the road west. The news was devastating. He demanded that the army counterattack. Gamelin's answer was grim. He said he had no reserve strong enough to seal the gap. A few days later, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill flew to Paris to assess the situation. Standing with French commanders, Churchill asked where the strategic reserves were. The answer was the same. There were none. Here is why. French doctrine, developed in the years after the First World War, was built around a concept called the methodical battle. The army believed modern war required enormous preparation, careful coordination, and slow, deliberate movement. Speed was the enemy of order. Every advance had to be planned in detail, supported by artillery, and carried out step by step. This doctrine worked in the trenches of 1918, but in May 1940, German armor was advancing at a speed the French command system could not match. French counterattacks were being ordered, planned, staffed, and prepared by the book, only to find that by the time the units moved into position, the Germans had already passed through. The French command system, built for a war that moved in hundreds of yards, simply could not keep pace. And it was not just doctrine. It was the physical structure of command itself. Gamelin sat at Vincennes. His subordinates, General Alphonse Georges, who actually commanded the forces in the northeast, was based at La Ferté-sous-Jouarre, some 40 miles away. The third headquarters was at Montry. The Air Force commander was at yet another location. Orders passed through multiple layers. Messages arrived hours late. Even when Gamland finally issued a formal operational instruction, the chain of command remained fragmented. Meanwhile, German armored commanders used radio-equipped forward vehicles. They made decisions in minutes. Their officers on the ground had standing orders to push forward, exploit any gap, and keep moving. The contrast was not just tactical. It was a collision between two entirely different ways of thinking about war. Once through Sedan, the German panzer columns turned west and drove for the English Channel, like a sickle cutting through wheat. The maneuver is often called the sickle cut. Here is an irony that deserves attention. France fielded a comparable number of tanks to Germany in May 1940. Many French tanks, including the Char B-1, were better armored and more heavily gunned than many German panzers. In a one-on-one engagement, a Char B-1 could be a dangerous opponent, but French doctrine often scattered these machines across the front, parceling them out in small groups to support infantry units. The Germans massed their tanks into concentrated divisions, striking at a single point with overwhelming force. It was not simply a question of who had better equipment, it was a question of who used it better. By May 20, 1940, just 10 days after the invasion began, Guderian's forces reached the coast at Abbeville. The Allied armies were now split in two, the best French and British divisions. The ones that had rushed into Belgium were trapped in a pocket in the north. The rest of France lay open to the south. On a map, the German corridor from Sedan to the Channel is a thin wedge, barely 50 miles wide in some places. German commanders at the highest levels worried that the flanks were dangerously exposed. Senior commanders tried to slow the advance, and Hitler issued the better-known halt order on May 24, 1940. Guderian, furious at the delays, labeled his continued advance a reconnaissance in force to avoid directly disobeying the order. His superiors were not fooled, but his success was undeniable. In the north, the situation was collapsing. By May 18, 1940, Brussels and Antwerp had fallen. Belgium surrendered on May 28, 1940, when King Leopold III ordered his army to lay down its arms. The British Expeditionary Force, along with over 100,000 French soldiers, fell back to the beaches around Dunkirk. Between May 26 and June 4, 1940, in what became known as Operation Dynamo, a fleet of Royal Navy warships, civilian boats, and fishing vessels evacuated roughly 338,000 troops across the English Channel. It was a remarkable feat of improvisation, but it was also a defeat. The men came back without their equipment. Tanks, artillery, trucks, everything was left behind on the beaches. A photograph from Dunkirk shows the beach littered with abandoned vehicles stretching to the horizon. Lines of soldiers wade into the surf, waiting for boats that might or might not come. It is one of the most striking images of the entire war. And here is a detail that often gets overlooked. About 40,000 French soldiers who stayed behind to defend the perimeter at Dunkirk were captured after the evacuation ended on June 4, 1940. They fought to buy time for the boats. French forces held the line around the port during the final days, allowing the last transports to sail. Many of those men would spend years in German prisoner-of-war camps. Their sacrifice is rarely mentioned in the story of Dunkirk. On June 5, 1940, the Germans launched the second phase of the campaign, codenamed Fall Rot or Case Red. French and British forces tried to hold a line along the Somme and Aisne rivers, a defensive position that General Weygand had hastily organized. For the first 2 days, the resistance was fierce, far stiffer than many accounts suggest. French soldiers fought hard. Units along the Somme held their ground under punishing air and artillery attacks. But without reserves, without air cover, and with their best units already destroyed or trapped in the north, the line could not hold for long. On June 7, 1940, Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division broke through near Rouen. A report from his advancing column described French resistance crumbling as tanks poured through the gaps. By June 9, 1940, German forces had crossed the Seine. Italy declared war on June 10, 1940, sending troops into southeastern France, though it achieved little against the French Alpine defenses. The Italian attack made little difference to the outcome. The French government fled Paris, first to Tours, then further south to Bordeaux. On June 12, 1940, General Weygand told the cabinet that the war on the mainland was lost. Entire French armies were disintegrating under the weight of the German advance. It was a blunt assessment. On June 14, 1940, German troops entered Paris unopposed. The city had been declared an open city to spare its buildings from destruction. A famous photograph shows German officers standing beneath the Arc de Triomphe. Hitler himself visited Paris days later. In one of the war's most recognizable images, Prime Minister Reynaud, who had wanted to continue fighting from North Africa, resigned on June 16, 1940, when his cabinet voted against him. He was replaced by Marshal Philippe Pétain, the 84-year-old hero of Verdun in the First World War. Pétain immediately sought an armistice. On June 18, 1940, from a studio in London, a little-known French general named Charles de Gaulle made a radio broadcast on the British Broadcasting Corporation, calling on French people to resist. Very few heard it at the time, but it would eventually become one of the most famous speeches in French history. Hitler chose the location for the surrender with deliberate cruelty. On June 22, 1940, French officials were brought to a forest clearing at Compiègne, the same place where Germany had signed the armistice ending the First World War in 1918. The same railway car was brought out of a museum for the ceremony. German newsreel cameras recorded every moment. The location was chosen for symbolic humiliation. Under the terms, Germany would occupy northern and western France, including the entire Atlantic coast. A rump French state under Pétain would govern the south from the town of Vichy. The French army was to be largely disarmed. The French fleet was to remain in port. And at nearly 1.8 million French prisoners of war remained in German hands. Many were put to work as forced labor in German farms and factories. Their absence placed a heavy burden on families in France. Many would not return home until 1945. Remember the castle at Vincennes where this story began. A general sitting in a room without a radio, sending orders by motorcycle courier, commanding an army built to fight the last war. The fall of France in 1940 was not a story of cowardice. French soldiers fought and died in enormous numbers. More than 80,000 French and colonial troops were killed in the campaign. That is not the record of an army that refused to fight. Losses in some units were severe, but bravery cannot overcome a broken system. The French army dispersed its tanks among infantry divisions, instead of massing them for concentrated strikes. The high command was fragmented and slow to communicate. Doctrine demanded that every counterattack be carefully prepared, while the enemy advanced at the speed of an engine. The German victory was not inevitable. Historians have identified moments where a faster French response might have disrupted the entire operation. A counterattack at the Sedan bridgehead on May 14, 1940, was delayed and dispersed. A determined strike at Guderian's exposed flanks during the race to the Channel might have cut the Panzer corridor. The opportunities existed. The system could not act on them. Some historians argue that the seeds of this failure were planted in the trauma of the First World War itself. A generation of officers, scarred by the carnage, built an army designed to avoid another bloodbath. They succeeded in avoiding open field slaughter, but in doing so, they created a machine too slow, too rigid, and too fragmented to survive the war that actually came. Marc Bloch, a French historian and army officer who served in the 1940 campaign, wrote one of the most devastating accounts of the defeat. He argued that the defeat reflected failures in thinking and command as much as equipment. The Germans moved faster and seized the initiative. The French system relied on caution, preparation, and method. In the collision between these two approaches, speed won. German losses were serious, but far smaller than the losses inflicted on the Allies. The fall of France is still a story of an army that fought hard but was overwhelmed by a system that moved faster than its own command structure could react. Now go back to that photograph from Dunkirk. The abandoned trucks on the beach. The soldiers wading into the water. And think about the 40,000 French soldiers who were left behind when the last boat sailed. They did not run, they stayed, and most of them vanished into years of captivity. The fall of France was not a failure of courage, it was a failure of command, and nearly 2 million men paid the price. If this story helped you understand why France fell, and why it was not the simple story you may have heard, consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories like this one, stories that deserve to be told the right way.